The garden was dying and nobody knew why, but I did. It wasn't the drought, it wasn't climate change, and it wasn't a busted pipe. It was Karen. HOA Karen, to be specific. While kids cried over shriveled tomatoes and retirees stared at brown cucumbers wondering if the apocalypse had finally arrived, Karen was out front hosting a meeting about color-coordinated fences and what she called, with no irony, aesthetic harmony. The truth was that she had drained my rain tanks in the middle of the night. All of them. 9,000 gallons of water gone in one night, siphoned off like she was stealing gasoline in a zombie movie. And the kicker? That water didn't just water my backyard or a few daffodils. It fed the entire community garden, the only source of fresh produce in our HOA during the worst drought in 40 years. The entire neighborhood was about to find out that the nosy tyrant who fined people for leaving bikes on their porch had just committed an act of ecological sabotage. My name's Jake, and I live at the edge of Rose Hill Pines, a planned HOA community that looks great in brochures and feels like a prison with nicer mailboxes. I'm a software engineer by trade, but water systems became my side passion after the big drought hit 5 years ago. The HOA banned lawn watering, restricted irrigation hours, and practically put a bounty on anyone who used a hose outside of 6 to 8 a.m. That's when I got to work, slowly and quietly building a series of rainwater collection tanks around the back half of my property, all hidden from street view. They weren't just for me. I piped that water directly to the community garden 3 blocks down, where old Miss Delaney grows carrots bigger than her arms and single moms bring their toddlers to pull onions out of the dirt like it's Christmas morning. I never told the HOA. Why would I? It was private land, a private system, and most importantly, it worked. The garden thrived. Even as the rest of the neighborhood browned out and neighbors resorted to fake turf, our little oasis stayed green. Nobody questioned it too much. They assumed some miracle, or maybe the city had carved out an exemption. Karen noticed. She always noticed when people were happy and tried to correct it. The first time she said anything, she leaned on my mailbox like she owned it and said, "Jake, it seems like your back area is suspiciously lush. Got anything you'd like to report to the HOA?" I played dumb. I told her it must be a shady microclimate. She narrowed her eyes like I had just told her I was storing plutonium back there. That was 2 months ago. I should have known then. She asked to inspect my backyard for code violations. I said no, citing privacy. She fined me $50. I ignored it. She doubled it. I installed a taller fence. Then, one morning last week, I walked outside with a mug of coffee and the gut feeling something was wrong. The tanks had a low hum when full, and that morning they were silent. Dead silent. I jogged around the back, nearly dropping my cup when I saw it. The water gauges all at 0, like someone had pulled the plug on the whole operation. I checked the piping, the filters, the outlet. Nothing was leaking. Nothing was broken. Then I saw the main outlet valve. The lock was cut. My breath caught in my throat. I sprinted down to the garden. It looked worse than I feared. The peppers were limp, the squash were curling, and the tomato vines, once fat with red fruit, were sagging to the ground like they'd lost the will to live. People were already gathering. Mrs. Delaney was crying. Little Eli from Unit 34 asked if someone had poisoned the plant. I didn't know what to say, not yet. Then, as if summoned by the devil himself, Karen pulled up in her HOA golf cart, her cat-eye sunglasses reflecting the sun like some kind of malevolent spirit. She stepped out holding a clipboard and waved like nothing was wrong. I wanted to confront her right there, but I needed proof. Anything else would let her spin her web of lies. I went back home, dug through security footage. My cameras didn't catch that side of the tank. But Jerry the beekeeper might have caught something. He lived diagonally behind me and kept bees on his roof. Naturally, his solar camera covered half my yard and most of the street behind it. I biked over and told him what happened. He scratched his beard and said, "Well, Jake, she's been real nosy lately. Let's see what the hive cam says." We loaded up the footage, and there she was, 2:07 a.m., trench coat, rubber gloves, bolt cutters in hand. She knelt, twisted, waited, and walked away like a villain in a Bond movie. Jerry let out a long whistle. I said nothing. I just stared. What kind of person drains a neighborhood's lifeline because she doesn't like how it looks from the sidewalk? What kind of HOA president destroys something that was helping hundreds just to feel powerful for one night? And worse, how many people would suffer before the truth came out? I didn't just see a woman on tape. I saw a disaster. I saw the destruction of food, water, effort, and community. The kind of loss that didn't just kill plants. It crushed spirit. But I wasn't done. Karen had started a water war, and she didn't know I had allies. More than she could count. And she really didn't know who that water fed. She just thought it was me. She had no idea she had just made enemies out of the nicest people in the world. The ones who bake extra zucchini bread and leave it on porches, the ones who bring extra tomatoes to the food pantry, the ones who believed in helping neighbors even when their HOA didn't. Karen had attacked the roots of something far stronger than a garden. She just hadn't realized yet. But she would. Very soon. The day after I found the tanks dry and the garden gasping for life, I didn't waste a second. I knew something was off from the start, but now I had to prove it. I spent the morning crawling through the piping system like a mechanic diagnosing a race car. Every valve, every pipe, every connection was intact, except one. The main outlet valve, the one I had locked with a rust-resistant steel clasp, was hanging open with a clean snap through the lock. Someone had cut it. Not broken, not rusted, not tampered by accident, cut. That wasn't nature or equipment failure. That was a person with intent. I could already feel it in my gut who it was. But I needed more than gut feelings if I wanted to bring this to light. I walked the property perimeter, looking for signs of entry. The outer fencing had no holes or damage, but one side of the hedges had been slightly pushed apart, as if someone squeezed through. Karen's house sat 3 properties away, but her surveillance and eyes seemed to cover the entire neighborhood like a prison watchtower. I couldn't shake the image of her face that morning at the garden when everyone was panicking. She was smirking behind her sunglasses like she'd just finished a chess game and was watching the loser try to figure out which move doomed them. Still, I needed hard evidence. That's when I remembered Jerry, the beekeeper. His hive boxes were installed on an elevated platform facing the back alley and a portion of my tank. More importantly, he'd recently added a solar-powered security cam to keep raccoons away from the honeycombs. I rode my bike to Jerry's place and knocked. He was out back, sipping coffee next to a swarm of buzzing bees that would have sent any normal man running for cover. When I told him what happened, he scratched his beard and nodded. Said he'd seen Karen creeping around a few times and didn't like the way she always asked questions about his solar wiring like she was planning a heist. We went inside and pulled up the footage. The timestamp showed 2 in the morning, dark and quiet, until a figure emerged from the shadows wearing gloves and a hoodie. I leaned closer. The camera quality wasn't perfect, but the gait, the hair tucked into the back of the hoodie, and the glint of oversized earrings confirmed it. Karen. There she was, twisting the spigot, cutting the lock, watching as thousands of gallons of water rushed out into the ground and vanished into the storm drain. She stood there for 5 minutes, then left the same way she came. Jerry turned to me with a whistle. That's HOA sabotage, he said like it was an official crime category. I asked if he'd mind giving me a copy. He handed me a flash drive without a word. As I left his house, my mind was spinning. I had visual proof. Now what? Confronting her directly would just give her time to lie and scheme. She'd probably spin it as an emergency response or claim she was inspecting a leak. No, this needed to go bigger. I had to let the neighborhood see who they had put in charge. But before I went public, I needed to gauge how much damage had already been done. Back at the garden, the situation was grim. The peppers were drooping like melted wax. The basil had yellowed overnight. Soil that had once been rich and moist was now cracked and dusty. A few volunteers were trying to salvage what they could, using bottled water and buckets from home. Kids were there too, looking confused, asking if the garden was going away forever. One woman tried to lift a wilted squash and ended up holding its stem with the whole plant crumbling off. People weren't just sad, they were angry, bewildered, scared. And none of them knew why this had happened. I realized I had been the quiet hero for too long. Nobody knew the water came from my tanks. They didn't know how delicate the system was or that one act of sabotage could undo years of planning. I stood on one of the benches and asked everyone to gather around. My voice was shaking a bit, but I spoke clearly. I explained how the garden's water supply didn't come from the city but from rainwater I had collected and filtered from my property. I told them how, for years, those tanks had kept the garden alive when no one else could. I explained how it was never about recognition or praise. It was just something I could do, so I did it. Then I told them what happened. The lock, the drainage, the footage. At first, there was silence. Then the questions came fast. Who would do this? Why would someone destroy something so good? What could be done? When I told them I believed it was Karen, several people didn't even look surprised. Apparently, her reputation had been spiraling for some time. She had sent fines to veterans for flying their flags at an angle. She once shut down a lemonade stand run by schoolchildren for not having a temporary permit. One woman said Karen knocked on her door last month because her wind chimes were excessively cheerful. The pieces were adding up fast, but evidence still mattered. I promised them I had video and that I was going to take it to the HOA board at the next meeting. That's when things started to shift. The people who had once been silent began speaking louder. They offered to help me compile testimonies. They wanted to write letters, sign petitions, show up to meetings. What Karen had done hadn't just affected one garden. It had betrayed the trust of an entire community. And it was time she faced the consequences. The meeting was set for Thursday night. I had 4 days to build my case. I printed the still images from the footage. I burned copies onto DVDs. I compiled a timeline showing the garden's success up until the sabotage. I gathered every message of support and every story from the people who depended on that garden. The woman who grew herbs to make tea for her cancer treatment. The elderly man who taught his grandson how to plant cucumbers there. The single mom who used the produce to cut grocery costs in half. Each story was a brick in the wall of truth I was building. Karen had kicked it, but it wasn't going to fall. It was going to stand taller than ever. By the day of the meeting, word had spread. More people than usual were expected to show. I wasn't nervous. I was focused. The night before, I stood in the garden and looked over what remained. Weeds were already creeping in. Some plants were too far gone. But others, the ones with deeper roots, were still fighting. I ran my hand over the leaves, whispered a quiet promise, and went home to prepare. Karen didn't know it yet, but her carefully constructed world was about to unravel. And the best part? I wasn't going to yell, accuse, or cause a scene. I was going to show the truth and let the neighborhood decide. I had been quiet long enough. Now it was time to speak with evidence, with facts, with the voices of everyone she had silenced. The garden wasn't dead. It was waiting. And so was I. I spent the next 2 days gathering everything I needed. The footage from Jerry was solid gold, but I knew Karen wouldn't go down without throwing every rule and clause in the HOA handbook at me. She was the type who quoted page numbers when writing violations on sticky note. If I went public with the video, she'd accuse me of trespassing, privacy invasion, maybe even video manipulation. I needed to build a case she couldn't squirm out of, no matter how many laminated bylaws she carried in her tote bag. I talked to Mrs. Delaney and a few others who worked the garden daily. Each one told me their story, what the garden meant to them, and how the drought had made that plot of land more than just vegetables. It was therapy. It was stability. It was a place where they didn't feel forgotten. Every single one of them agreed to write statements, not just about the value of the garden, but about how it was mysteriously thriving up until Karen's midnight plumbing adventure. I even found a couple who'd seen Karen near the tanks late at night before, always acting suspicious, always glancing over her shoulder. Karen, meanwhile, wasn't staying quiet. She started sending out newsletters calling for a complete visual audit of all properties to ensure compliance with HOA aesthetic standard. That was code for purge. Anyone who had a flower pot out of line, a solar panel visible from the street, or, God forbid, a bird bath with a chip in it was suddenly receiving warnings. She was trying to flex, to remind everyone she was still in charge. But her grip was slipping. People were whispering. Some started asking questions about the garden. Others wanted to know where the water went and why it all stopped so suddenly. The spark had been lit. I just needed the right moment to pour gasoline on it. That moment came at the next HOA meeting. It was supposed to be routine. A quick update on neighborhood watch, a vote on the color palette for front doors, and some chatter about putting speed bumps near the elementary school. But I had no intention of sitting in the back row this time. I showed up early with a USB stick and a backup hard drive. I wore a clean button-down shirt and left my hoodie at home. I brought 3 printed copies of every witness statement and a folder marked "Evidence" in big bold letters. The meeting started normally, Karen acting like the Queen of England at a bake sale, smiling and waving while the rest of the board looked mildly sedated. But when she called for new business, I stood. I said my name. I said I had a matter that involved potential misconduct by an HOA officer. That got everyone's attention. Karen tried to cut me off immediately, citing protocol. I held up the bylaws she loved so much and quoted her own words from a previous meeting. Residents are allowed to bring matters to the board if they involve possible harm to the community. She froze, smiled that fake smile, and told me to continue. I walked to the projector and plugged in my USB. The room dimmed. I played the footage. Karen crouching in the dark. Karen twisting the valve. Karen walking away as water spilled into the storm drain and vanished forever. Gasps echoed. Someone dropped a cup. One woman muttered what sounded like "Oh my God." Karen's face went pale, then red, then pale again. She lunged toward the laptop like she was going to shut it down, but I stepped in front. The board members, now fully awake, demanded she sit. She did, but she was fuming. I passed out the printed statements. I explained the purpose of the tanks, how they fed the garden, how they were legal, permitted, and installed at my own expense. I reminded them that these tanks had helped hundreds of residents, that not a single dime from the HOA was used, that Karen had not only destroyed vital resources, she had done so deliberately, with full knowledge of the consequences. Karen tried to speak. She claimed the tanks were an eyesore. She said she was acting on behalf of the HOA's interest in curb appeal. I pointed out that the tanks weren't visible from any public road, that they were behind a fenced portion of private property, and that she had trespassed. Her tone shifted. She accused me of operating an illegal water distribution system. I showed the permits. She then said the garden wasn't under HOA jurisdiction. I presented the letter from the HOA itself, dated 3 years ago, officially recognizing the community garden and encouraging resident participation. She finally just snapped and shouted that she was trying to save the neighborhood from property value collapse. That's when it happened. Someone stood from the back row. A woman in her late 60s, tall, confident, and holding a binder thicker than Karen's ego. Her name was Sarah. She was on the original HOA Foundation Committee. She said something I'll never forget. "Karen, you've forgotten something important. A home is not just an investment. It's a place to live. And no one wants to live in a place where the leadership punishes kindness." There was a moment of silence. Then the clapping started. Not thunderous, not like a movie, but slow and deliberate. One by one, people joined in. Karen looked like she was melting. The board called for a motion. A temporary suspension of Karen's authority pending a formal investigation. It passed unanimously. Karen stood up, yelled something about witch hunts, and stormed out. But before she did, she turned to me and said, "This isn't over." I smiled and said, "I know. Because I'm not done either." The next morning, I received a letter from the city. Apparently, someone had reported me for illegal irrigation and unlicensed water distribution. The report accused me of siphoning water from public sources and charging for it, which, of course, was completely false. But it showed me one thing. Karen was not going quietly. She was going to fight, even if it meant lying to every authority she could find. I knew then that I needed more than just truth. I needed a plan. One that wouldn't just defend my name, but protect the garden for good. I reached out to some local contacts, including a nonprofit that specialized in urban agriculture. They were shocked to hear about what happened and offered to help. I sent them everything: permits, video, statements. Within 24 hours, they had issued a press release. Local outlets picked up the story. A community garden shut down after HOA president destroys water source. Photos of the withered crops, the cut lock, and the tanks started making their rounds online. Support started pouring in. Karen had made this personal. I was about to make it public. And she had no idea how big this was going to get. By the time the city inspector showed up at my door, I wasn't even surprised. Karen had escalated, just like I expected, only now she was dragging government departments into her tantrum. The man who arrived wore a city badge, had a tired face, and carried a clipboard that looked like it had seen one too many bureaucratic battles. He introduced himself politely and said there had been an anonymous report of unauthorized irrigation systems and illegal water distribution on my property. I didn't flinch. I invited him in for coffee. He hesitated but followed me around back where the tanks sat, now partially filled from a rare night of rainfall. I handed him the folder with all my permits, schematics, HOA recognition letters, and documentation of every penny I'd spent installing and maintaining the system. I even showed him the bypass pump I had added for emergencies and pointed to the drip irrigation lines leading to the garden. It was clear, neat, and 100% legal. He took notes, asked a few questions, and then glanced at the camera feed Jerry had printed out and attached to the folder. His eyebrows rose slightly at the image of Karen in her night raid outfit, bolt cutters in hand. I asked him if this looked like someone reporting a legitimate violation or someone trying to cover up their own mistake. He didn't respond, but the smirk on his face told me everything. He said he'd complete his report and notify me of the findings within a week. Before he left, he added quietly, between sips of the coffee I gave him, that he used to live in an HOA too, and that this wasn't the first time he'd seen a power-hungry board member try to bury someone with paperwork. While the inspection cleared me, it opened up something far more damaging for Karen. In her report to the city, she'd claimed the tanks had been tampered with and that I'd rerouted water illegally to avoid utility costs. That forced a secondary inspection, this time of the drainage and overflow systems. What they found was jaw-dropping. Karen had installed an illegal underground pipe from the HOA maintenance line directly into her backyard irrigation. Not only had she drained my tanks, she had been rerouting city-supplied emergency water into her own decorative garden for months. Her rose bushes were being treated better than the community vegetable bed. The city had photographic evidence, a site report, and an itemized list of violations that were about to hit her like a freight train. I didn't even have to leak it. One of the assistants from the city's environmental department talked to a reporter from the local paper, and the headline ran the next morning: HOA president accused of water theft during drought investigation. It spread like wildfire. Local TV stations picked it up. The community garden was suddenly a symbol of resilience and community support. Interviews aired with Miss Delaney, with kids from the nearby school who used the garden for class projects, and even Jerry, who managed to get his bees in the shot during his interview. The support was overwhelming. People donated. Volunteers came out in droves. Some helped repair the irrigation. Others replanted. One woman from 4 neighborhoods over came with a truck full of soil and mulch and said she'd seen the story on Facebook and couldn't just sit back. What Karen tried to destroy was turning into a movement. Karen didn't take it well. She filed complaints, sent out angry emails to the HOA mailing list, and even tried to spin the story as an act of cyberbullying and harassment. But the damage was done. The board, now embarrassed and increasingly disconnected from her, began distancing themselves. Some even began resigning. That's when the final twist arrived. A black SUV pulled up outside my house one afternoon. A woman in a navy suit stepped out and introduced herself as Linda Castillo. I blinked, recognizing the name. Former mayor. She had retired 3 years ago after helping fund urban agricultural programs across the city. She smiled and said, "You probably don't know this, but your rain tank system was on our radar. We'd been quietly tracking community-led initiatives for a future environmental grant. When the news broke, I knew I had to come." She walked through the garden like she was inspecting sacred ground. She asked questions, took photos, and said the garden was one of the best examples she'd seen of what sustainable local farming should look like. Then she said she wanted to testify. When I asked her what she meant, she said the city had filed an injunction against Karen and was opening up a civil case for tampering with water systems and interfering with community resources during a declared drought emergency. They needed community impact statements. They needed to show a pattern. And she wanted to be the first one to go on record. The hearing date came fast. The courtroom was packed. Karen walked in wearing a pearl necklace like she was attending a fundraiser. Her lawyer looked visibly annoyed, probably because she'd insisted on representing her side with a slideshow presentation about HOA leadership integrity. The judge wasn't amused. As evidence was presented, one thing became clear. Karen's story had holes big enough to drive a tanker through. She claimed she thought the tanks were illegal. The judge pointed out that she had approved HOA documents recognizing the garden. She claimed the system was abandoned. Footage showed her walking around it with bolt cutters. She claimed she never diverted water. The inspector's photos proved otherwise. Then came the fatal moment. One of the city attorneys presented an email. It was from Karen to the HOA board, dated 2 days before the tank sabotage. In it, she wrote, "If we can't get Jake to remove those hideous drums, I'll find another way. I've already found where the master valve is. No one needs to know." The room went silent. Karen's lawyer turned to stone. The judge stared at her like she was a child who had just confessed to writing on the walls in crayon. Then came the kicker. Karen had submitted a document to the court claiming the valve had been broken and leaking, justifying her actions. But a city technician had found no signs of leak. And worse, the document she submitted? It had a fake technician's name. One that didn't exist in the city employee directory. Perjury. The courtroom erupted. Karen stood up and tried to speak. The judge ordered her to sit down. Her lawyer leaned over and whispered something in her ear. Her face collapsed. The judge declared that charges would be forwarded for further investigation and ruled in favor of the city's claims. Karen would be fined, removed from all HOA positions immediately, and barred from holding any such role for a minimum of 5 years. I watched it all in silence, the same way she had watched my tanks drain. Only this time, it was her reputation circling the drain instead. As I stepped out of the courtroom, surrounded by reporters and community members, I didn't feel victorious. I felt relieved. The fight had been ugly, personal, and exhausting. But it had ended in truth, in accountability, in justice. Linda Castillo clapped me on the back and said, "Not everyone can stand up to power like that. But you didn't just defend your property, Jake. You defended an idea. You proved that one good system, built quietly and with care." Karen's removal from the HOA board sent shockwaves through the neighborhood, but the aftershocks were even more satisfying. Within a week of the court ruling, the HOA office issued a public apology through an emergency newsletter, trying to save face. They blamed a lack of oversight and a misunderstanding of leadership boundaries, but no one was buying it. The truth had already reached every doorstep, shared over fences, through group chats, and blasted on the neighborhood Facebook page that Karen had once controlled with an iron grip. Residents who once kept their heads down were now walking a little taller, waving more openly, and organizing garden workdays with a kind of energy I hadn't seen in years. It was like the whole community had been let out of a pressure chamber. And I wasn't the hero. The garden was. It had reminded them what togetherness felt like. The best part? We weren't done yet. With Karen gone, the board was practically begging for someone to step up and propose solutions. I didn't want a title, but I was willing to help rebuild. I drafted a proposal to expand the garden, not just restore it. I mapped out plans for additional beds, composting bins, a rainwater education center for local schools, and even a small greenhouse using recycled materials. What surprised me most was how quickly people jumped in to help. Jerry offered solar panels from his garage. The twins down the street offered to paint murals. Miss Delaney's niece, an architect, sketched out a beautiful community seating area shaped like a leaf. Within 2 weeks, we'd formed an informal coalition of volunteers, and the HOA, trying desperately to mend its reputation, signed off on everything with a unanimous vote. It felt surreal. The same board that once fined me for an unauthorized fence was now thanking me for saving their most beloved public space. And then came the rain. Real, heavy, steady rain. The kind that makes kids run out barefoot and dogs hide under porches. 4 hours, it soaked every inch of the garden, the lawn, the roofs, and most importantly, the tank. I stood there in the downpour with a grin on my face, watching the gauges rise, each tick upward feeling like justice being poured back into the earth. Jerry shouted from across the fence that he was putting out extra hives next season. Miss Delaney twirled under an umbrella like a teenager. The soil drank it all in, and the plants stood taller by the next day. Life, real life, was returning. Karen, meanwhile, had vanished into bitter silence. Her once daily complaint emails ceased. Her posts online had been deleted or locked. I heard from a neighbor that she had to do 50 hours of community service, and the city, in a delicious twist of irony, had assigned her to landscape maintenance. No one knew exactly where she'd be working, but rumors flew like dandelion seeds in the wind. I wasn't expecting to see her again, not so soon, and definitely not like this. One Saturday morning, as we were installing new garden signage donated by the school art club, a city truck pulled up. Out stepped Karen in an oversized neon vest, holding a pair of gloves and a clipboard with her head down. No one said anything at first. She didn't look up. She walked stiffly toward the tomato section, kneeling beside the very same plot she had let wither weeks earlier. Her expression was unreadable, somewhere between humiliation and forced resolve. A few people stopped what they were doing. A few whispered. I said nothing. I just handed her a trowel and walked away. Let the soil do the talking. The transformation of the garden continued, but it became more than a redemption story. The city recognized the effort and announced a surprise grant for water-conscious community effort. We won. The funds allowed us to add more storage tanks, more shaded beds, and a backup solar-powered pump. Students from the local school began weekly visits to learn about agriculture, sustainability, and community service. What had begun as a secret system behind my fence had now become a living classroom, a symbol of resilience and a cautionary tale wrapped in green. During one of those school visits, I noticed a little girl staring up at one of the new signs that read "Watered by the community, not control." She turned to her teacher and asked what it meant. The teacher said, "Sometimes people try to take things that aren't theirs to control. But when we work together, we grow stronger than anyone who tries to stop us." That stuck with me. That single sentence summed up everything that had happened. Karen had tried to control something meant to be shared, and the moment she broke that, she lost everything. Not because of me, but because no one supported her in selfishness. Everyone supported the garden because the garden gave something back. I went home that night and stared at the blueprint I'd made years ago when I first built the tank. I thought of all the mornings I spent fixing leaks, the nights I worried about storms, and the frustration I had buried when Karen first questioned me. I realized something funny. I had never intended to fight a war. I just wanted to grow something that mattered. The war came anyway. And now, standing at the end of it, I felt peace, not triumph. The garden was the victor, not me. I was just its caretaker. One evening, the board held a small gathering to celebrate the full reopening of the garden. It wasn't formal, just folding tables with lemonade, cookies, and handmade cards from the kids. People laughed. A woman played acoustic guitar. The sun set behind the rows of restored plants, and the air smelled like basil and damp mulch. Near the center of the garden stood a new addition, a wooden plaque carved by one of the neighborhood veterans. It read, "Rooted in kindness, watered by unity, grown through struggle." Beneath it was a list of names, not of donors or sponsors, but of every volunteer who had helped rebuild. I didn't expect it, but someone called my name and handed me a microphone. I hadn't prepared a speech. I didn't want to preach. So I said the only thing that felt true. Thank you for believing in something small. Sometimes it takes losing water to realize how deep the roots go. There was a pause and then applause. But the best sound came after, when a little boy nearby giggled and shouted, "Hey, the strawberries are back." Everyone turned to see a red fruit peeking out from the vine. It was perfect. That was the last sign anyone needed. The drought might continue. The HOA might still be a mess in other corners. But the heart of the neighborhood, the garden, was alive again. Karen's reign was over. Her name faded into quiet shame. And in her place grew something stronger. A legacy not of fear or rules, but of community and growth. A reminder that sometimes, when someone drains your tanks, it's only so the rain can come back stronger. You just have to be ready to catch it.